Yep.
I'm sure it was a mixture. The tradition is mixing two names.
Sit. We're running out of time.
All right,
Assemble. I like that. Yeah, Seattle Atheist Church, assemble. That sounds like, what is it, the superhero call for the Incredibles.
Yeah. Right. Herding cats.
All right, let's get started. So,
Stop.
What?
We're gonna record this.
I already said let's get started.
You're doing it wrong.
Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, you are all welcome here. We call ourselves Seattle Atheist Church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium.
All right, so let's, nicely done. All right, so let's get started. So today's talk is all about emotions in man and animals. And the goal of the talk today is I want a list. I want a list of human emotions. And the reason I want this list, I have reasons for this, is I have two reasons. Reason number one, in the last sermon where I talked about Darwin's theory of morality, right? And from Darwin's perspective, the roots of human morality can be found in the social emotions. So that raises the question of, well, what are these social emotions, right? What are these social emotions which are supposed to be the basis for morality? And without a clear understanding of what these emotions are, we can't start, thinking about more questions. So I think an understanding of emotions is important for being moral. But the second reason that I'm interested in human emotions is I also think the secret to human happiness can be found in emotions. Where else would you look? I mean, happiness, joy, all that kind of stuff. Those are emotions, right? And so having a good understanding of what the emotions are important to leading a happy life. So those are my two motivations, to be moral and to be happy. And that's why I wanted to investigate the emotions. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of people. Sorry about that. But I'm going to give you one of the things, the takeaways is there's far less progress in the study of emotions than you would think if you go through the research. So basically, I spent the last 2 weeks reading everything I could about the history of emotion research, and I've assembled this together for you today. So I wanted to go through this. I want to start with Darwin, our friend Darwin. You remember last time I talked, we were talking about The Descent of Man, right? That was the book where he tackled humanity. But one of the things that he started to write about was human emotions in The Descent of Man. But then the material kept expanding and expanding, and decided to make that into a separate book. So that's when he wrote his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And he actually started this book, he finished The Descent of Man, he waited 2 days, and then he started writing this other book with the material that he had collected together from the previous book. His thesis in The Expression of Emotions was simple. He was trying to support his general claim that there's no difference in kind between human emotions and animal emotions. Remember, that was part of his main argument in The Descent of Man. He wanted to say that human morality, human emotions, human mental states are no different in kind. They might be different in degree, but not kind, than any of the other forms of life on Earth. And so the expression of the emotions was just a continuation of that basic argument. Okay, so what he started the book by having a very modern worry, by worrying about the methodology for investigating emotions, because he said he noticed that it's really easy to influence people's perception of what emotional expressions mean by giving them a backstory. He would take the same pictures of people with different facial expressions, and he would get different responses. And so he said, look, you have to be very, very careful about just taking people's reports at face value. We need a good methodology in place. And so he came up with 6 methods. This is kind of, I guess you can't say triangulation when you're talking about 6 methods, but basically he wanted to triangulate on a list of emotions by cross-comparing these different approaches to figuring out what the emotions are. I just want to go through those 6 different approaches. First, what he did is he looked at babies, because the idea is if you look at infants, they haven't had a chance yet to hide their emotions, and you'll get a raw, sort of exposure to what emotions are. So he started there. He also was friends with someone who ran an insane asylum. A good friend to have in this case. And so he got information about, again, the insane you wouldn't expect to be able to necessarily control their emotions, or they would be stronger in the insane than in a Victorian man. So he got information from that doctor. He also took advantage of the Duchenne experiments. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Duchenne experiments, but this was a scientist in France who, what he did is he put electrodes on a person's face, and he activated, the electrodes and could make the different muscles contract. And this poor old guy is one guy in all the pictures. The pictures are, but supposedly the guy didn't have any fillings in his face, so it didn't hurt him. But at the time, it took a long time for the pictures to be exposed. So this poor guy, they're like, electrocuting his face to get these different muscle motions to be able to, and then they had to take this long photo to get his. But the valuable thing from it is they were able to, from the Duchenne experiments, they were able to figure out which muscles correspond to different facial expressions. But so he took advantage of that. The other thing he did is he looked at the history of art, because he wanted to see in paintings and in sculpture, how do people draw, or how do they sculpt out different emotions, because artists should be experts on it. He said in general that was almost useless, and the reason for that was in art, people are usually trying to make people look beautiful, and it turns out that when people are using their muscles in their face, he says usually most painters make people faces placid so that they appear more beautiful. So actually, he didn't get a lot of information out of looking at artwork or sculptures. And then the next thing he did, and I think this is actually the most interesting thing he did, is he created a survey. He created a survey, but he sent it to everywhere in the world. He got feedback from the Dayaks of Borneo. He got feedback from Native Americans in the United States. He found everyone he knew, every missionary out there, and he sent out. He got 36 responses from it, but he got it. The idea was to find whether which emotions are universal by reaching out and saying if people have the same expressions no matter where they are. And then finally, the final thing he did is he looked at animals, right? He looked to see, well, what are the expressions in animals, and let's compare them to man. And that was the foundation of all of his research into emotions. And so the rest of the book was devoted to two things. First, he came up with what he called the 3 principles of emotional expression. So he had 3 principles from his research. And first principle was, it's a really funny name, the principle of serviceable associated habits, So the idea here is if in the past there was something that you always did that accompanied an emotion, then that habit, even though it was originally voluntary, it would turn into an automatic habit and then be passed down to future generations. So things like, let me give you some examples of that. Humans, when they're really, really angry, show their canine teeth, right? Their lips pull back, they show their front teeth. And, the reason for that, according to Darwin, is, in the past, this was, when you got angry, you would, start ripping out a person's throat, right? If you look into primates or whatever. And the reason that humans do it is, in the past, it was a voluntary thing that became inherited over time, and now, when we're angry, we show that expression, and that's just because it was once a serviceable habit, but now it's just become instinctual, and it's just automatic, and that's how a large number of expressions of emotions form when they get associated with something that was serviceable in the past. Another example of that are dogs. When dogs get angry, they move their ears back, really close against their head. And the reason for that, at least according to Darwin, is when dogs fight, dogs will try to rip off each other's ears, and you want to keep the ears, really close to the head. And so now, dogs just do it automatically. Whenever they get angry, their ears just go back next to their head. One more example, this is actually from some more modern research, but when people are afraid, your heart starts beating faster, right? But one of the things that also happens is all your blood rushes to your big leg muscles so that you're prepared to run. And when people get angry, again, your heart pumps, but all the blood rushes to your extremities, to your hands, so you're prepared to fight. So again, that fits into Darwin's picture because, you know, if you're getting angry and about to fight, well, you're all set up. Evolution's taking care of it for you. You're ready to, you know, start striking out at people. So that was his first principle. Second principle was this principle of antithesis. And the idea there are, if you want to show the opposite of one of those other emotions, you just do the opposite expression. And he said this is not a case where you voluntarily did this in the past and it became inherited in a habit. This is a case where you want to signal a form of communication that you actually want to express the opposite of one of those, you know, inherited emotions. So he gives this example. He used to take his dog for a walk every day. And when he took his dog for a walk, what he would do is he'd come to a fork in the road, and if he went one direction, the dog got a really long walk. He got to walk, you know, off forever. But if he went the other direction, there was a hothouse where Darwin raised plants. He did experiments on plants, and the dog would get a really short walk. And so he said he'd start off every morning with his dog. He'd be walking along with his dog. His dog would have his tail up. He'd be, you know, his ears would be wagging. Ears not wagging. Anyway, you get the idea. His ears up. He'd be, you know, happily, you know, marching along until he got to the fork in the road. And if he went the hothouse direction, his wife called this the hothouse face, but the dog's face would descend, his tail would go down, and he would just do the opposite of what he was doing up to that point. So, you know, this was his example. So that's the idea of antithesis. You do the opposite of the normal expression of the emotion to represent that you're in the opposite emotional state. His final one, let me read the name of the principle. It's called the principle of actions due to the constitution of the nervous system independently from the will and independently to a certain extent of habit. So what's he talking about here? This last one is nervous energy, right? So there's no serviceable habit associated with this at all. This is just a biological fact about humans. One of his main examples of this is when people's hair turn white when they get really, really scared. Was one of his examples. Now, of course, we know currently that that's impossible because, you know, people's hair is dead. So it can't actually turn white immediately because it's already dead, so it's not going to change any color at all. But anyway, that was one of his examples. A better example of that is your muscles trembling when you're afraid or when you're really emotional. That's just nervous energy coursing through you, and it has to be, I don't know, you have to tremble to let it out. So it's kind of a, you know, electricity view of emotions. So these were his three principles. Those were Darwin's three principles of emotions. And then in the rest of the book, he tries to apply it. It's a huge number. What he does is he gives a huge number of anecdotes, personal stories, stuff that, you know, seems very unsystematic now, but he's just amassed as much evidence as he could to show how his three principles are applied to all these different emotions. So he goes on, he has a chapter devoted to suffering and weeping. Has a chapter devoted to low spirits, anxiety, grief, dejection, and despair. That's not a fun chapter. Then he has one on joy, high spirits, love, tender feelings, devotion. And then he has a chapter on self-attention, in other words, embarrassment, shame, shyness, modesty, blushing. So, and that's, you know, really the structure of the book. So let me, here are sort of my takeaways from reading the Darwin book. First, I thought it was great that one of the things that Darwin does is at no point does he say that the only emotions that exist are the ones that are expressed by people. For example, he says, not all emotions have strong outward signs. Love, jealousy, it's really hard for artists actually to even paint things like jealousy. They usually cheat and they put things in context in the scene so that you know that the character is jealous in the picture. And he has a general theory. He says that if there's no action that makes sense to take immediately after feeling the emotion, then there's going to be no outward expression of it. So in the case of love, well, we want to expect there to be any, you know, standard expression of love because there's no action you immediately have to take. In the case of fear, well, you know, you have to get out of there. So there's a lot of outward expression. So he says if there's no direct expression from emotion, don't expect there to, if there's no action, don't expect there to be a strong expression. The other thing that Darwin's very clear about is, of course, animals have many of the same emotions as humans do. That shouldn't be surprising, given his overall thesis. But he says stuff that would make a behaviorist, head explode all over the place. He's attributing emotions to different animals. He spends a lot of time. Darwin loves his dogs. It's obvious he loves the dogs. He spends all this time talking about his dogs grin all the time. All the grinning dogs he has. They don't smile. He makes a distinction between grinning and smiling. His dogs grin, they don't smile. And he even says insects have emotions. They express anger, terror, jealousy, and love by their stridulations, by how they make sounds with their bodies. The other thing that he does, which I think is great, is he talks about blind people. Including like Laura Bridgman, who was a famous blind person at the time. But he talks about blind people and how they express the same emotions using the same facial expressions as sighted people do, which gives him more evidence that, emotions must be innate. If blind people do it and they haven't seen it, there's no way they can learn it. And that's actually supported by more recent, research into it, that blind people in general do show the same emotional expressions. And he also says things like shrugging and extending your arms in wonder. Those are innate, and he found that they're shared by all the races of man, the blind, and even very young children. So everyone shrugs. It's cross-cultural. But things like joining hands in prayer and kissing, those aren't innate. Those are different depending on which culture you're in. So that was his general conclusions. Okay, so that's Darwin. And Darwin's book now, it came out over 100 years ago. So let's fast forward right through behaviorism, through functionalism, and we're going to move up to Paul Ekman. Now, how many of you know who Paul Ekman is? Yeah, okay, so some of you do. Don't know Paul Ekman? Have you ever seen the show Lie to Me? There's a television show, Lie to Me. Yeah, it's a great show. So the Lie to Me character is based off of Paul Ekman. So the main character is like a psychologist superhero, but there's all these scenes in Lie to Me where he can, detect people's emotions, and then he figures out who the bad guy is. But he has this glass room he keeps in the middle of this office where he goes around and he's like, he's hiding that emotion. And it's like, now he's caught the bad guy in this episode. But it's a great series. So Paul Ekman was responsible for editing the 3rd edition of Darwin's book, of the expression of emotions in man and animals, which came out in 1999. He actually got in a little bit of trouble for it because he spent all the footnotes complaining about what was in the text, and it seemed more like he was advancing his own theories. But he got involved in the research of emotions in 1965. And just to give you some background context, so this was the 60s, and no one believed that emotions were universal. No one was talking about the biological basis for everything. Everything was culturally constructed in the 1960s. And this was done in the context of Margaret Mead and Bird Wistell. Am I pronouncing his name right? Wistell, yeah. Bird Wistell, who at the time claimed that, even smiles, in certain cultures, people smile when they're unhappy. And so all of these things are all culturally relative. They're learned. It's a blank slate, right? The head's a blank slate that has to be filled in by culture. And so Ekman was sent off, though, on this study to discover whether emotions are universal. And so what he did is he took a set of photos, and he went to all these different countries, including, back to the Dayaks of Borneo, this poor Dayaks in Borneo, back to Papua New Guinea, to all around, to different areas of the earth to show the photos and then see if people would identify the same emotions from their photos. Surprise, surprise, yes, he was able to replicate the same stuff Darwin did over 100 years ago, but he was able to show that, in fact, these emotions are universal, and that people expressed, for a small set of emotions, they expressed in the same way. So happiness, anger, disgust, and sadness, those he was able to always replicate across cultures. People express those in the same way. Oddly, he was not able to replicate the difference between fear and surprise. Telling the difference between fear and surprise wasn't possible for his studies, and he still isn't clear about why that is. So his basic emotions, he has basically 5, right? He has happiness, anger, disgust, sadness, and then this fear surprise thing. Later in the 90s, Ekman updates his list of emotions, but later on, he doesn't really base his updated list of emotions on any study. It's more like, he starts making a bunch of distinctions between different types of happiness, and it's mainly introspection, so I'm going to ignore that stuff and just stick with his original list of emotions that he got out of his studies by doing the cross-cultural comparison. Okay, so one thing that Ekman ran into almost immediately, though, was the whole issue of, going back to what Bert Whistle said. He said, that sometimes people smile when they're unhappy. How do you explain that? Ekman explained that by coming up with this concept of display rules. If you're playing soccer with an opposing team, you're taught from a early age. If you lose the game, you're not allowed to go out there, stomp your feet, storm around. You're not allowed to to throw a fit over it. You have to pretend to be happy about losing the game. That's the display rule. And so the idea is that different cultures have these different display rules. So in fact, you might smile when you're unhappy, or you might smile when you're angry, because you're following the display rules for your culture. Okay, so I want to give you sort of a sense of at the level of Ekman, what these different emotions, what he's able to detect. So one of the things that I came across while I was researching this is there are now a couple of startups that have put together software. They use deep learning, automatically identify emotions by people's facial expressions. And I just want to give you a sense of how that software works. I looked at, there's one company, Effectiva, who has software like this. They're trying to get people to integrate it into video games so they can tell whether or not people are excited or whatever while they're playing the video game. I want you to get a sense of what they can detect with this thing. So, hey, I need a volunteer. Anyone wants, do you want to volunteer? Who wants to volunteer? All right, you can volunteer.
First. Me too? Can you make 2 volunteers?
All right, yes, we can have 2 volunteers.
Wow.
All right, so I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see this, because you have to see this on the little teeny computer here, but we'll try it anyway. So the basic idea is this software, what it does is it picks up on points on your face, and I'll get it right there. And it's probably impossible for you guys. Can you see anything? Probably not.
I don't see the
I'll show it to you later.
Points.
Well, so
I'm sure now it's got the points.
yeah, it has the points all over your face.
Just
So,
smile.
so Thini, I'm going to give you a piece of candy, and you'll see on the top all those green and red bars. Those are picking up on the changes in her facial expression. No, I'm not, Thini. I lied. You're not getting any candy at all. And so now it's turned red. It's gone from green to red. That's good. And then, that's really sad. And then, so it's we're going all red there. So it's picking up on all these different things. All right, Ada, did you want to try it real quick?
No,
all
I'm
right.
charging.
Thini, sit down. All done. All right. So Ada, after this, let's go to Disneyland. No, I'm just kidding. No Disneyland. That's great. All right, fantastic. Thank you, volunteers. No. Yeah, it's all right. Anyway, just great. All right, thank you, volunteers. But so you probably couldn't see that because the screen is so small. But what it's doing is it's picking up on smiles, it's picking up on brown raises, brown furrows, valence, which we'll talk about later on, engagement and frowns. And for things like smiles, it's picking up on the distance between things like the eyebrow and the different spots in your eye. And for brown furrows are super important. It's picking up when they go in the middle. So it's finding these standard places on your face and using that to try to calculate these very basic emotions. And I think this is great software. I actually think it's very cool. And I can see where it could be fun, maybe to, I don't know, they're integrating it with some of the video chat applications right now, which kind of be nice when you're Skyping someone, have a little meter on the bottom and say, hey, this person's angry, you might want to change what you say. So I can see the potential of that. But the other thing, and again, I don't really want to take away from the software, but the other thing that, one thing I noticed about it is it's a really blunt instrument, right? I mean, this is not, when you see the show Lie to Me, and the guy's like picking up on subtle changes in emotions, and this isn't going to do that. This is a very, very blunt instrument that's picking up on stuff that, major changes in your face to be able to do its magic. Okay, so let me move on to, so the other thing I want to say, I want to say 2 things really about Paul Ekman. First thing I want to say about Paul Ekman is Ekman is only focused on public expressions, right? So he doesn't really seem to believe that there's anything beyond just these public emotions. For him, emotion is whatever can be publicly displayed in this way. So it's very basic for him. In fact, he says some really, really odd things. He writes, for example, earlier I wrote that emotions are necessary for our lives, and we wouldn't want to be rid of them. I am far less convinced that moods are of any use to us. If I could, I would forego ever having any mood again and just live with my emotions, which, seems odd. Really? I mean, seriously, you don't want to be in a happy mood? I don't know. But for him, emotions, unlike Darwin, by the way, but for him, emotions are things that have to be, expressed, have an outward expression. And I think that's becoming, because of the time period he was working in, he was working within the context of behaviorism, right? And so the only thing, it was actually super controversial even for him to talk about emotions at all at that time. And it was enough for him to say there was any sort of public expression at all. But this still seems very, very limited, especially after, reading about Darwin finding all these emotions in his dog and his insects in his backyard. All of a sudden, this guy has a very restricted set of emotions that he's willing to talk about. Okay, so that's Ekman. Now I want to move on to talk about local scientists. He's actually in the Washington State area. His name is Jacque Panksepp. I don't know if you've come across him before, but he does research. He started a new discipline called affective neuroscience. And the idea of affective neuroscience is he, like Darwin, well, he's interested in studying emotions not only in humans but animals. He became famous originally for his research into animal laughter. So this was something that you could find around the internet for a while. Chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, they all laugh, right? And for the longest time, people didn't realize that because animals don't laugh like humans laugh. They don't make the same sound, so you shouldn't expect, a big belly laugh from an orangutan. The way that these monkeys laugh is they make panting sounds. But they do it if you tickle a chimpanzee, they start panting. And they do it in the same scenarios as we would laugh. They just make a different sound to do it. But the thing that was especially shocking, what Panksepp was able to show, is not only primates, but also rats. Rats laugh. And no one knew that rats, one of the most studied creatures in the lab, no one realized that rats laughed. But it turned out that they laugh at high frequency, beyond what humans can hear. And so what he did is he created a device that translated, it was actually originally created for bats, to translate the high frequencies into lower frequencies. And then he found that if you tickle a rat, it does in fact start chirping and laughing. And then what he discovered is that rats really like to be tickled. And in fact, they'll chase them around in the lab, the rats, because they want to be tickled so badly. And they start finding that when rats play, that they'll start laughing in that scenario too. So it's just people couldn't hear it before, but all this laughter was going on, on all these experiments. Those rats could have been laughing at you all the time, scientists. You just wouldn't know it, but it was there. So anyway, his whole thing, his other discovery, by the way, which I also think is going to be relevant later on, he also discovered that rats can have more than one type of fear. Rats are afraid of open spaces for obvious reasons. They don't like to be out in open spaces, so that's one fear. And one part of their brain lights up in that scenario. But the other thing they are afraid of are cats. Again, not surprising that if you just take some hair from a cat and put it next to their cage, that's going to freak out a rat. But it actually activates another part of their brain. So they have two different types of fears that we lump together into calling fear, but they actually have different neurological bases caused by different scenarios in the past that they're protecting themselves against. So that's super interesting as well. All right, so what Panksepp does is he's all into triangulation, and that should be familiar by now. That's the same sort of Darwin triangulation that we talked about earlier. But when he talks about triangulation, he talks about three things. He triangulates among human introspection, among animal behavior studies, so he does spend a lot of time studying rats. But the third thing he does that Darwin wasn't able to do is he has access to those big machines. So he can do fMRI studies and actually see what areas of the brain are lighting up when you do different things. So functional magnetic resonance imaging, the way it works is apparently neurons don't store their own calories. So when a neuron fires off, it immediately has to get more calories from the blood system. And so based off the blood flow, you can tell which areas of the brain are being activated. So he's using that to try to triangulate again self-reports of emotions and actually see what's going on inside the human brain. So his theory is, he has a theory of 3 layers of the brain. So there's 3 parts of human emotions. He divides human emotions into primary process, secondary process, and tertiary process. And the primary process, that's our lizard brain. That's our primordial emotions. And so we have in our primary process, we share these emotions, he claims, with all mammals. And in fact, he wants to claim all vertebrates. But these are the emotions that are hardwired deep within our brains. And those are 7. And the 7 emotions are seeking, fear, rage, lust, care, panic and grief, and play. So those are the primordial emotions that we share with every other animal on Earth. Each of these emotions, by the way, is positive or negative. That's important so he can do his rat experiments, because he needs to see whether the rat, if something like play, for example, has to be a positive thing to get rats, so he can do experiments in the lab. One of the interesting things that he discusses is, this is a horrible word, decorticated animals. Even decorticated animals show these emotions. Now, what does that mean? So even animals that have lost their cortex, and unfortunately, they still have the emotions. And unfortunately, even human babies are sometimes born without a cortex, which is horrible. They only have their deep brain, and they still have these basic emotions. People with dementia often, still have the emotions even though they've lost cognitive ability. And he uses this as evidence that these deep emotions are instinctual. They're inherited. They're not generated by the higher levels of the brain. So that's his primary process. Those are his raw emotional feelings, but I like it when he calls them primordial emotions, but those are the basic emotions. Then there's the secondary process. That's where he gets, he allows Skinner to do his thing. That's where classical and instrumental operant conditioning happens. That's how you teach pigeons how to play ping pong, right? It's all at that level. And then at the third level, tertiary process, that's where thought and deliberation happens. And that's where he says social emotions, such as guilt, jealousy, shame, awe, hope, humor, reverence, and the experience of the sublime. That's all in the tertiary process. That all requires cognition, culture. These are social things. And he believes that these emotions, the tertiary emotions, diverge among mammalian species. So, different types of animals have different social emotions because they're socially learned. And these are all concentrated in the frontal cortical regions of the brain. So that's his division. That's his basic theory. All right. So I've given you sort of 3 perspectives on what the emotions are. The original, Darwin. Then we talked about Paul Ekman. And then I